The wind howled through the pines, a mournful sound that seemed to echo the hollowness in Henry Whitaker's chest. He stood on the creaking porch of his remote cabin, a chipped mug of black coffee steaming in his calloused hands, and stared out at the vast white expanse of rural Montana. Winter had come early this year, blanketing the rolling hills in such a thick coat of snow that it swallowed sound, leaving the world in a hush as heavy as his own grief. Where once he might have relished the quiet, cherishing it as an invitation to reflect on life's smaller wonders, now that silence felt unmerciful. It loomed around him, pressing in on all sides, reminding him that he was alone. 5 years ago, Henry had never known such silence. His days were filled with the lilting music of Clara's laughter, bright, warm, and unguarded, and the constant chatter of little Lily, who had a question for every insect, star, and strangely shaped rock she encountered. He used to stumble over her toys scattered across the porch, and he would find pieces of Clara's embroidery in every corner of the house. Back then, even the night was alive. Clara might hum as she prepared tea, or Lily would wake from a dream and pad into the living room, tangling herself in Henry's arms with the simple trust of a child who believed her parents could protect her from anything. Now, those sounds existed only in his memories, fragile treasures locked behind a door in his mind that he was both afraid and desperate to open. Henry lifted the mug to his lips and took a tentative sip, grimacing at the bitterness that seemed to coat his tongue. It was too strong, too bracing, but he drank it anyway. It grounded him, provided a momentary anchor against the swirling tide of recollections that threatened to drag him under. His gaze drifted toward the tree line, where the snow-laden pines stood in solemn rows like silent sentinels. That was when a flicker of movement caught his eye. Something darted between the trunks, low to the ground. He leaned forward, his breath catching. A bobcat emerged briefly from the shadows, a sinuous shape of tawny fur, its tufted ears pricked in alert curiosity. It paused, amber eyes meeting Henry's across the distance. For a moment that stretched longer than it should have, the two regarded each other. Henry felt his chest tighten with the swift, startling pang of connection. Then, just as swiftly, the bobcat turned and melted back into the woods, leaving nothing but the echo of that wild stare. Henry exhaled, shaking his head at his own disorientation. "Crazy old man," he murmured, "seeing ghosts in the trees." He swallowed the last dregs of coffee, retreated into the cabin, and bolted the door against the cold. Inside, the cabin offered little comfort. It was a modest, utilitarian space, built more for function than for beauty. The wood stove dominated one corner, its iron belly already losing warmth, and the sagging couch across from it bore the imprints of countless hours spent in solitude. A small table stood by the window, covered in a haphazard collection of tools, nails, sandpaper, and half-completed wooden carvings that Henry no longer had the motivation to finish. These carvings had once been gifts for Clara or little trinkets for Lily, things he would craft late into the evening, whittling the smooth pine into shapes he thought would make them smile. Above the stove, on the soot-stained mantel, sat a single photograph. The edges had curled from years of exposure to heat and neglect, but the image was still clear enough. Clara, her dark hair blown back by a warm summer breeze, and Lily, squirming on her mother's lap, both smiling at the camera, smiling at him. In that captured instant, they looked so real, so alive, that Henry felt the knife of grief twist in his gut every time his gaze wandered there. Yet he couldn't bring himself to remove the photo. The sight of it was painful, but the thought of banishing it to some dusty drawer was even worse. It was all he had left, and though it stung like a wound that refused to heal, he could not bear to let it go. That night, as a frigid wind battered the cabin walls and made the timbers groan, Henry dreamt of the accident again. In his sleep, he heard the screech of tires cutting through a peaceful afternoon, felt the nauseating jolt of the car slamming through a guardrail, the rush of wind as the vehicle tumbled down the embankment. Shattering glass rained around him. Clara's scream echoed in his ears, and Lily's small cry seared through his heart. He woke drenched in cold sweat, his breath ragged, his pulse hammering so fiercely it made his temples throb. Jolted into wakefulness, He stumbled from the couch to the wood stove, throwing in extra logs, desperate for its glow to chase away the darkness of the memory. No matter how many years passed, those images returned unbidden, relentless in their torment. He wanted to forget, but perhaps he believed, deep down, that he didn't deserve to. Morning came with heavy clouds crowding the sky. Henry rose at dawn, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside to split wood, routine tasks that gave shape to the lonely hours. The rhythmic thud of the axe as it bit into the logs was the only sound in the hush of the snowy landscape. He paused now and then, letting the steam of his breath dissipate into the icy air, losing himself in the methodical cycle. Raise the axe, bring it down, feel the shudder, watch the wood cleave, repeat. The monotony was a balm that kept him from drifting into the mire of his own thoughts. Then came a low, pained yowl. The sound was sharp, carrying through the stillness like a plea for help. Henry froze, axe balanced precariously over his shoulder, and listened. Another cry followed, weak and distressed. He set the axe down in the snow and trudged toward the edge of the clearing, boots crunching. There, half hidden by a drift and a tangle of rusted barbed wire, lay the bobcat he'd glimpsed the day before. Its hind leg was ensnared in the barbs, fur matted with blood, and it hissed in alarm when Henry approached, ears flattened in a show of terror and pain. Henry stood a few feet away, heart pounding with a sudden sympathy he hadn't expected to feel. The animal was wild, untamed, a spirit of these woods. Nature could be cruel, and many in Henry's position might have turned away, allowing the inevitable to unfold. But something in the bobcat's eyes, something fierce yet vulnerable, caught at the frayed edges of Henry's heart. "Easy," he murmured, the sound rough from lack of use. The bobcat snarled, its lips curled back from sharp teeth. Henry observed the twisted wire, the angry gash. An older Henry, an older version of himself, might have called the local vet or even a wildlife rescue. But this new Henry, who had withdrawn from the world, had no one to call, and perhaps that made him realize he was the only one who could help. He retrieved a pair of thick gloves and an old blanket from the cabin. Moving slowly, mindful of the bobcat's thrashing claws, he worked to free the animal. It was a painstaking process. Every time Henry shifted the wire, the bobcat hissed and struggled, teeth snapping perilously close to his hands. Yet Henry continued, his concentration pinned to the task. Every hiss or spasm of pain the creature gave felt like a small blow to his own heart. Finally, with a grunt of exertion, he pried the last of the barbs free. The bobcat tried to bolt, but its injured leg buckled in the deep snow, and it collapsed, panting. Henry crouched near it, breath misting in the frigid air. "Looks like you need somewhere warm," he said quietly. In that moment, he recognized in the bobcat's predicament a mirror of his own plight. Both of them were trapped, battered, and bleeding, even if Henry's wounds were invisible. Ignoring the creature's weak snarl, he wrapped it gently in the blanket, lifted it in his arms, and carried it inside. Over the next few days, his life took on a new, if unexpected, purpose. Henry cleaned the bobcat's wounds with warm water and antiseptic, carefully avoiding another snap of those lethal jaws. He managed to splint the leg using splinters of scrap what he had in his workshop, binding them with cloth strips. The bobcat, whom Henry began calling Shadow, more to have something to speak to than anything else, was wary, wounded, and resentful of captivity, but it was too weak to mount a real escape. Henry's care was clumsy at first. He had grown unaccustomed to tending anyone or anything, but he recalled how Clara once nursed a fledgling sparrow with a broken wing, holding it in gentle hands as she coaxed it to eat softened seeds. He remembered Lily's bright eyes watching that tiny bird, her questions filling the air like the chirping of a whole flock. "Do you think it's lonely, Mama? Does it miss its Mama and Papa?" Henry had teased her about being so inquisitive. Now he found those echoes of memory a comfort instead of a torment. Every day he forced himself to speak to Shadow, even if it was just to mutter a greeting or offer a few words. The bobcat would regard him with unblinking eyes, as if weighing his intentions. When Henry placed a bowl of meat scraps on the floor, He'd back away and wait until Shadow hobbled over. Their fragile bond was forged in the silent understanding that they each had no one else. During these days, small recollections of Clara and Lily came to Henry unbidden. Times when Lily's laughter rang through the house like bell chimes, or when Clara ran her fingers through Henry's hair as he carved wooden toys by the fire. He remembered the softness of Lily's cheek against his shoulder and the melodic sound of Clara humming lullabies. Once, the memories would have cut him to the core. Now he found them gentle, if still tinged with heartbreak. They were reminders of love that once filled this cabin from floor to rafters. Time passed in a kind of hushed truce between man and beast. Shadow's wounded leg began to heal, and Henry marveled at the bobcat's resilience. Even as it limped, it grew stronger, its fur glossier, its eyes sharper. Henry had begun to think of the day when Shadow would inevitably return to the woods, reclaiming the freedom of the mountains. Strangely, that thought knotted his stomach with dread. He had come to rely on the bobcat's presence, a living, breathing reminder that there was still something in this world needing his care. One night, Henry found himself talking to Shadow more openly, as though the animal could understand every word. Maybe it did in some mysterious way. "I know you don't belong here," he said softly, gaze flicking to the dark window beyond which snow still drifted. "You're as much a part of these mountains as the clouds in the sky. I can't keep you, and I shouldn't try." He paused, swallowing hard at the admission. "But I guess I'm just not ready to be alone again." Shadow, curled on a makeshift bed of blankets near the stove, flicked an ear but did not move otherwise. His calm acceptance of Henry's voice was answer enough. That night, a fierce blizzard rolled in, rattling the shutters and howling down the chimney. The wind whipped snow into drifts against the cabin walls, piling it so high it nearly reached the windows. The world outside vanished in a swirl of white fury. Henry slept fitfully, his dreams haunted by images of Lily and Clara trapped in an endless vortex of swirling snow, their voices calling for him but fading each time he tried to answer. He woke to a preternatural stillness. Daylight brightened the snow outside, a painful glare that seeped around the edges of the window boards. He sat up, rubbed the sleep from his eyes, and looked over to Shadow's nest of blankets. It was empty. Alarm pricked him, sharper than any fear he'd felt in months. He searched the cabin, under tables, behind the couch. Nothing. Shadow had vanished, presumably slipping out at some point during the storm. Henry threw on his coat, yanked open the cabin door, and braced himself against the cold blast. Outside, there were no tracks. The wind had swept them away, concealing all evidence of the bobcat's escape. "Shadow!" Henry called into the silent pines. Only his echo returned. A wave of unexpected loneliness swallowed him. He realized, with a pang, how quickly he had become attached to that wounded creature, how it had filled a small corner of his otherwise barren existence. Stumbling back indoors, Henry felt something inside him sink, as though he were losing Lily and Clara all over again. But this time, it was a final reminder that everything he cared for always slipped away. The storm's aftermath kept him sealed inside for 3 days. By the time the winds calmed, the snow was so deep he had to shovel a path just to get to his woodpile. There were moments when, drenched in sweat and gasping for breath, he would straighten up and scan the horizon, half hoping to see a bobcat's lean shape or to hear a familiar cry. But the woods remained quiet. Trapped in the cabin with only his regrets and the memory of fleeting companionship, Henry found himself grappling with a deep well of grief he had tried for so long to ignore. Clara's face came to him then, unbidden, soft brown eyes brimming with kindness, and Lily's laughter echoed in that quiet space until it brought tears to his eyes. He thought of the accident again and his futile efforts to protect them. "I'm sorry," he whispered into the silence, the words cracking on his tongue. "I failed you both. I couldn't—" His voice broke, and he let the tears come, shoulders shaking with the force of 5 years' worth of unshed sorrow. On the 4th day, the sky cleared. The morning sun turned the snow into a field of glittering diamonds, pristine and dazzling. Henry was slumped on his couch, drained by his grief, when a knock startled him. It had been weeks, maybe months, since anyone had been at his door. He opened it to find Sheriff Tom Bennett, his face ruddy from the biting cold. Snow clung to his boots, and the man's breath fogged in the air. "Morning, Henry," Tom said, casting a cautious glance around the interior of the cabin. "Storm like that, I figured I'd better check on you." "I'm fine," Henry replied, though his voice carried little conviction. Usually, Tom would accept such dismissal, but not today. "Got some soup for you," Tom said, holding up a dented thermos. He stepped inside uninvited, eyeing the state of the place. The rumpled blankets, the pile of unwashed dishes in the sink, the evidence of someone barely holding on. "Henry," he said quietly, "you don't look fine. You can't keep going on like this. Clara and Lily. You don't get to tell me what they'd want." Henry cut in, his tone bristling with warning. Tom sighed, setting the thermos on the wobbly table. "No, maybe I don't. But I know they loved you, and I know you're still here. This place, it's becoming a mausoleum. You're punishing yourself for something that wasn't your fault." Henry's hands curled into fists at his sides. The impulse to lash out flared up for a moment, but it extinguished just as quickly. He felt only exhaustion. "Please go," he said hoarsely. "I appreciate you coming, but go." Tom looked at him for a long beat, sympathy and resolve mingling in his eyes. "Take care of yourself," he said at last, his voice gentle. Then he stepped out into the snow, leaving Henry alone once more. In the silence that followed, Henry stared at the photograph on the mantel. For years, he had avoided meeting Clara's gaze in that picture, fearing the condemnation he was sure he deserved. But now he found himself looking, truly looking, at the joy in her expression. She was smiling because she loved him, because that day had been bright and full of promise. Lily's tiny hand rested over Clara's, the child's face tilted toward the camera in open wonder. There was no blame in either pair of eyes, only love immortalized on paper. That night, the moon rose high and cold, painting the snow in silver. Henry, unable to sleep, paced the cabin restlessly. Then, faintly, he heard it, a distinctive carrying yowl, as if from a great distance. He rushed to the window, heart pounding. Outside, perched on a low rise near the tree line, was Shadow. Even in the moonlight, Henry could see the bobcat's heeled leg bearing its weight easily, its tail flicking once in silent acknowledgement. Their eyes locked, and Henry felt that same surge of connection, a wordless understanding that both of them had survived their wounds. A breath later, Shadow turned and trotted into the woods, pausing only once to glance back before disappearing into the darkness. Instead of loss, Henry felt a stirring of something else. Relief, perhaps, or even a glimmer of hope. When dawn came, Henry brewed a fresh pot of coffee and drank it slowly, letting the warmth spread through his chest. He looked around the cabin, the tools and unfinished carvings, the photograph on the mantel, and made a decision. Quietly, almost reverently, he packed a small bag. Before leaving, he banked the fire in the wood stove, then stepped out into the crisp air. The drive to the cemetery took 2 hours, the roads treacherous with ice and drifting snow, but Henry pressed on. At last, he arrived at a small, wind-swept graveyard nestled in a copse of pines. 2 simple headstones stood side by side, Clara's marked with a floral motif she had once admired, and Lily's etched with a tiny star. Henry trudged through the snow, his throat tightening when he saw that the wind had swept the marble clean. He knelt, removed his gloves, and placed a trembling hand on each stone. "I miss you," he said, the rawness of his voice carried away by the breeze. "Every single day. I don't know how to stop wishing I could change what happened. But I'm going to try. I'm going to try to live. For both of you." The wind murmured through the trees, as if offering a gentle reply. He felt tears gathering at the corners of his eyes, but this time, he didn't fight them. It felt right to let them flow here, where Clara and Lily's spirits felt close. As he stood to leave, he thought he heard, far off in the distance, the cry of a bobcat, wild and free, a reminder that life went on in the mountains, and that he still belonged in the living world. Henry turned away from the graves with a heart that was not lighter, exactly, but no longer locked in perpetual winter. He had made his peace in that quiet clearing, among the pines and the snow, and though the memory of Clara and Lily would always walk beside him, he began the long journey back to the cabin with a renewed sense of purpose, carrying with him the lingering echo of that wild creature's call. A promise that, perhaps, even the most wounded hearts can find the strength to heal.